Hey guys, it's Daniel. Welcome back.
In my opinion, Jim Morrison and Pamela Courson had one of the most up and down relationships in rock and roll history. And that's saying something, given how many crazy relationships there have been in rock and roll. Jim and Pam had other crazy relationships themselves. As a matter of fact, Jim and Pam cheated on each other many times over the years. According to one of the women that Jim Morrison cheated on Pamela Courson with, he actually enjoyed getting caught cheating by Pamela. He apparently enjoyed seeing her angry reaction. He got a kick out of it. Knowing all that we know about Jim Morrison, that doesn't seem like a stretch. The person who said this is Pam Miller, also known as Pamela DeBarz, one of the most famous rock and roll groupies ever. According to her, on one specific occasion in 1967, Pamela Courson walked in on her and Jim. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life Death Legend by Stephen Davis. I have a lot of Doors and specifically Jim Morrison videos on my channel. If you want to help me make more videos, the best way to do so is to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Quote, Jim was still living part-time with the tourists, hookers, and Hollywood hopefuls at the rowdy Tropicana Motel, but he spent many nights in Pam's candlelit apartment in the ramshackle greenhouse in Laurel Canyon. He liked to get up around 2 in the afternoon, scratch himself, and get a beer if there were any in the fridge. Then he'd put on his acetate copy of the as-yet unreleased The Doors, and play it as loud as the neighbors could take it. The first time he did this, it attracted the surprised attention of naked except for panties Pamela Miller, one of Frank and Gail Zappa's brazen teenage babysitters, who was staying next door with a friend named Sandy. Miss Pamela recalled, I'd seen The Doors 100 times by then, and I really wanted to get to know Jim because I'd never seen such a blatant sexuality on stage before. And I was really surprised to hear this music coming out of this green shack behind the country store, because I knew The Doors had recorded an album, but it hadn't been released yet. So I slipped on my purple little dress, walked barefoot down the stone steps between our houses to see what ultra-hip neighbor had an advanced pressing of the Doors record. I tiptoed up on the old wooden porch and peeked in the window of the room that Crystal Ship was coming from. I stifled a scream as my eyes adjusted to the dark, and Jim Morrison came into focus, in the flesh, his hair mussed up, and wearing nothing but a pair of black pants. I was so flustered, I ran back to the pad where I was staying and tried to figure out what to do. A little earlier, I'd been given a quart bottle of a tranquilizer called Trimar by the bass player of Iron Butterfly, who had a day job working in a hospital. This stuff was used to block labor pains, and even a little bit poured on a handkerchief and inhaled made me feel like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. I grabbed the Trimar and negotiated the steps, got up on the porch, and bravely knocked on the door. When Jim answered, I smiled and introduced myself. What you got there? He asked, nodding at the bottle of clear liquid I was holding. When I next came to my senses, my purple velvet mini dress was over my head, and then suddenly there was his redhead girlfriend glaring at me with a look of pure hatred in her pretty eyes. I looked over at Jim. He had backed into a dark corner of the room, about to enjoy what he figured would be one of Pam's jealous tantrums. He was murmuring to her, "Get it on, get it on, get it on." It was one of those classic uh-oh moments. I stood up and offered the redhead a shot of the Trimar, but she just turned her back and told me I'd be better to leave. I went back up to Sandy's pad. Just as I got in the door, I heard Pam screaming, "Don't you dare go up there, Jim Morrison. Don't you dare." But he was already at the door, smiling shyly, extremely interested in another blast of the Trimar. Social niceties forgotten, we spent the rest of the afternoon and evening sniffing the stuff, sitting on the floor, laughing at everything and getting to know each other. I ran out of the stuff early the next morning, and Jim wished us a pleasant good night and politely thanked Sandy for her hospitality. What a gentleman. I was disappointed that he made no attempt to lay a hand on me, but now that we were friends, I had high hopes for the future, as long as that redhead wasn't around. End quote. Now, of course, Pamela Courson's life wasn't just significant to Jim Morrison. She also had a major impact on the Doors in many regards. I want to focus particularly for a moment on Jim Morrison's death. After he died, it opened up a lot of questions as to who had ownership of what exactly, what legally belonged to who. Pamela Courson was a key figure in this discussion. The following is from my documentary, The Doors After Jim Morrison. If you want to see the full documentary, the link is available in the description box below. Again, all the videos on my channel are original. If you want to help me make more videos, the best way is to subscribe to the channel. Now, Jim and Pamela, of course, were living together in Paris at the time of Jim's death, and Pamela is the last person known to have seen Jim alive. Pamela was using heroin, and Jim is said to have taken some of Pam's heroin that night, apparently mistaking it initially for cocaine. Pamela's main supplier was her other on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jean de Breteuil, a rich French count who, by the way, is said to have also supplied the heroin which killed Janis Joplin. In any case, Jim was not used to heroin, and according to many, it was the heroin that night which did ultimately kill him. Officially, Jim Morrison's death is listed as heart failure, but unofficially, many people believe it was heroin. More on that later. In any case, Pamela Courson was Jim Morrison's live-in girlfriend, and after Jim's death, Pamela made the case that she was actually Jim's common-law wife. Being Jim Morrison's widow would have legal ramifications when it came to Jim Morrison's estate. The following is from Doors biographer Jerry Hopkins. Quote, in 1971, 4 months after Jim died, in an effort to bolster her claim and to be granted an allowance and an advance from the estate, which was still then in probate, Pam filed a, quote, declaration in support of widow's allowance, claiming that all time since September 30th of 67, I have considered that I was married to James D. Morrison, and that I was in fact his wife at the time of his death and am now his widow. It was in 1967, as Light My Fire was finally dropping off the charts, that Pam said she and Jim spent a night in Colorado Springs. Earlier, she had Jim ask Doors lawyer Max Fink which U.S. states had the loosest laws recognizing common law marriage. In her court statement, Pam said, quote, Jim reported to me that he learned from an attorney that to create a marriage in the state of Colorado, it was sufficient if two people stayed together, had marital relations, and agreed to thereby be husband and wife, if, in fact, they thereafter conducted and held themselves out as each other's spouse. Jim and I spent the night at a hotel, had sexual relations, and agreed that we would forever be husband and wife. We very briefly honeymooned in Colorado and then continued our Doors tour. In December of 1971, the 3 surviving Doors filed papers of their own in court, making claims against the Morrison estate. Then, in April of 74, the Doors came back with another lawsuit. Eventually, a compromise was reached, though. Then, as the final accounting of the estate was being made, Pam died. A heroin overdose on April 25, 1971. If she had lived, she would have received about $500,000 right away, plus a quarter of everything the Doors would make in the future, a sum that subsequently proved to be worth millions. Pam died without a will, which meant her quarter share of all future Doors earnings went to her next of kin, her parents. Almost immediately, Jim's parents entered the fray, demanding their fair share as stated in the California Probate Code. On January 10, 1975, the 2 sets of parents signed an agreement dividing equally the proceeds from Jim's quarter share of all Doors revenue. But it was 1979 before all the loose ends were tied up and the parents started receiving any money. End quote. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where he discusses Pamela Courson's death and the subsequent legal fallout. Quote, Pamela Courson returned to Los Angeles a few days after Jim died and proceeded to play out a 3-year Ophelia-like mad scene. Reliable information about Pamela from this period is often unsupported and scarce since she lived in a demi-mundane life in a shadowy milieu of addiction, grief, and occasional mania. After recovering from her Parisian ordeal, she tried to resume her life in LA as Pamela Morrison. She talked to her dog as if she was talking to Jim. She always spoke of Jim in the present as if he were alive. The accountant informed her that Jim's estate, to which she was indeed the sole heir, could not continue to support her boutique, Themis, until the will was adjudicated, which could go on for years. Themis would have to close. Pamela became so enraged by this that she drove a car into the front window of the store. In November of 1971, she filed papers formally claiming the Jim Morrison estate, which was reported to include holdings in oil wells and California ranch land. The other Doors immediately sued Jim's estate for what they claimed were large outstanding cash advances that had been paid to Jim. The ensuing litigation left Pamela almost penniless. Pamela relocated to the Bay Area in 1972. She stayed in Bolinas with Ellen Sander for a while. Then she lived with some friends in Sausalito. Racked by crippling spasms of guilt, she would sit for hours by the telephone waiting for my old man to call. Ray Manzarek ran into her in Sausalito and wanted to ask her what happened in Paris. But when she saw him, she swooned in a paroxysm of grief and could only weep in his arms. A bit later, she contacted Jim's literary friend Michael McClure about Jim's remaining poetry. She loaned him the leather portmanteau, which she described as a doctor's bag that contained Jim's poems and notes, each filled in a binder and carefully arranged. McClure later returned the bag, expressing surprise at what he later called a miracle of order, and told Pamela that he felt the works could be published. Eventually, Pamela returned to Los Angeles. She had affairs with a younger rock star and an older French diplomat. She continued to have serious cash flow problems and a taste for heroin. To survive, she sold her jewelry, Jim's books, and anything that wasn't nailed down, though she managed to keep her small collection of Luger pistols. She was evicted from her house in the Hollywood Hills for non-payment of rent and moved into a garden apartment in West Hollywood. Paul Rothschild said that she used to turn up at his house at all hours, well supplied with barbiturates and heroin. She spent much of her time with Paul Rothschild crying. She kept saying over and over, "I just couldn't control him." Pamela had a lot of enemies. Some believe she had killed Jim Morrison for his money. There were people who were content to see her in extreme distress. They put out rumors that she was prostituting herself, but tracking these rumors always leads back to people who hated her. She may have been kept for a time by the rich Frenchman. Others swore or wrote in thinly sourced books that Pamela had confessed to killing Jim accidentally, that he had snorted massive lines of what she told him was cocaine, but which was actually China White. No one put it past her or stood up to say that it couldn't have happened. The Doors litigated Pamela for years. She had no money at all and had to be supported by family and friends. Lawsuits flew like bats at Sunset until early 1974, when it looked like there would be finally a settlement. Then the Doors sued the estate again, prolonging the agony. In April, the court recognized Pamela as James Douglas Morrison's lawful heir, and a full settlement was reached with the Doors. Pamela's initial cash disbursement, hurried through to relieve obvious financial distress, was $20,000. Friends say Pamela seemed a little better after things were settled. Others say she was more despondent than ever. She bought a cherry chrome yellow Volkswagen Beetle. She went to Saks Fifth Avenue and bought a monogram ranch mink stole. She phoned her connection and reportedly ordered an ounce of China White. The people she lived with found her dead on the living room couch on the afternoon of April 25, 1974. At first, they thought she was just taking a nap and let her sleep for hours until it began to get weird. Then, they noticed she wasn't breathing. The cops arrived. A man living in the house who said he used to drive for Jim and Pamela was questioned about Pamela's use of heroin. He volunteered that her quote-unquote husband had died of a heroin overdose in Paris 3 years earlier and that Pamela had recently spoken about looking forward to seeing him again soon. When they took her away, her long red hair cascaded over the side of the gurney as she was being lifted into the ambulance. The coroner could have called Pamela's death a suicide, but called it a massive pulmonary edema instead. The autopsy noted that she had a severe bladder infection. Ray Manzarek was asked to play at a memorial service for both Pamela and Jim, organized by the Coursons at Forest Lawn Cemetery on Monday, April 29th. Ray played When the Music's Over, Love Street, and Crystal Ship. Pamela's apartment was burglarized during the ceremony, and an unknown amount of Jim's effects were reportedly stolen. It is not known whether there was talk of burying Pamela's ashes with Jim in Paris, but they were later interred in a memory wall under the name Pamela Morrison in an Orange County cemetery. A week later, a probate judge officially awarded Pamela $500,000 and a quarter of the Doors' future royalty income, making the dead girl a virtual millionaire. It later emerged that her family suspected that Pamela might have been murdered, with suspicion reportedly following on a former in-law member of the Morrison family. An investigation produced no actionable results. Since Pamela had died without leaving a will, Jim Morrison's entire estate, including the executorship of his literary and artistic remains, passed to Pamela's parents, Corky and Marie Courson. Sometime after Jim Morrison's father, Admiral Morrison, retired from the Navy in 1975, the Morrisons sued for a share of their son's legacy. Several years later, a settlement awarded the Morrisons half of the financial worth of the estate, but left Jim's artistic legacy in the control of the Coursons.